Chapter 1. A Shocking Discovery, Chicago, November 1968. John stepped onto the porch of his home after a long absence, feeling a slight dizziness from the familiar smells that greeted him. This was his house, his fortress. But something was wrong. He expected to see Sandra, her warm smile and welcoming embrace, but instead he was met with emptiness and deafening silence. At first glance, everything in the house seemed to be in its place. The furniture stood as it always had. The same curtains they had chosen together still hung in the kitchen. Yet the air was filled with a strange emptiness that seeped into his very soul. John slowly walked through the rooms, noticing little details that began to disturb him. In the corner of the living room, an old coffee cup lay abandoned, as if someone had abruptly gotten up without finishing their morning coffee. On the coffee table, a newspaper lay, a week old, as if it had been carelessly tossed aside on its way to the trash. But the strangest detail awaited him in the bedroom. On the bed, neatly folded, lay a few women's clothes, a dress, shoes, and a handbag. However, something about them caught John's attention. They weren't Sandra's things. Moreover, on the bedside table stood a bottle of expensive perfume that certainly hadn't been there before he left. A cold suspicion began to take root inside him. He noticed a small note tucked under the handbag. John's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The short message, written in a hurried, nervous scrawl, read, "This is just the beginning. Take care. E." Suddenly he felt suffocated. He sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who was this E? And why had his home, his life, his Sandra suddenly become so unfamiliar? Before he could think any further, a quiet creak echoed through the house. John stood up sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for where his gun used to be. But now he was unarmed. The noise seemed to come from under the stairs. John slowly approached and opened the door to the space beneath them, but there was nothing, just darkness and dust. Yet, the sense of unease only grew stronger. His intuition, honed by years of service, told him that this was no simple coincidence. The home he had left in peace and trust had become a place of mysteries and shadows. He stepped outside to get some fresh air and clear his head, but his gaze lingered on the tire tracks leading away from their house. The tracks were fresh. Someone had left recently. Something was terribly wrong, and John knew this was only the tip of the iceberg. That short note marked the beginning of a series of events that would turn his life upside down. Chapter 2. The First Conflict. John stood on the porch of his house, staring at the fresh tire tracks that stretched toward the road. His heart pounded in his chest, a warning signal that something was terribly wrong. That inner voice, the one that had saved him on the battlefield, was whispering that he needed to act quickly. Someone had been here just recently, and they clearly didn't want to be discovered. With the cold calmness developed over years of service, John walked back inside to the telephone in the living room. He dialed Sandra's number almost automatically, not expecting her to answer. To his surprise, after several long rings, the line connected. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered on the other end. It was Sandra, but her voice was different, strained, distant. "Sandra? It's me, John. I'm home," he said, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. There was a long pause, followed by a quiet sigh. "John, I didn't think you'd come back so soon," she finally responded. But there was no joy, no warmth in her tone. Instead, her voice was tinged with nervousness, as if she didn't know what to say. "I returned earlier. Where are you? What's going on?" He tried to speak calmly, but the tension in his chest only grew. "John, I need some time. I can't explain everything right now. I'll be back soon. Just wait for me, okay?" Sandra spoke quickly, almost as if she was afraid someone might overhear her. Before he could ask anything else, the line went dead. John stared at the phone, disbelief washing over him. What the hell was happening? Who was this Sandra he had just spoken to? This wasn't the woman he knew and loved. The answers he needed were becoming more elusive and terrifying. John felt like he was trapped. He didn't know what to do next, but staying idle was not an option. He decided to call for help. He picked up the phone again and dialed the number of his old friend Mike, who had served with him and was as close as a brother. If anyone could help him figure out what was going on, it was Mike. "Mike, it's John. I need to talk to you. Can you come over?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "John?" "Of course, I'll be right there," Mike answered without hesitation, always ready to lend a hand. While waiting for Mike, John walked through the house once more, examining every detail, trying to find something that could shed light on the situation. He returned to the bedroom where he had found the note and noticed that one of the photos that he always kept on the nightstand was missing. It was their wedding photo, the only one that had always been there. He was sure it had been there before he left. When Mike finally arrived, John was on edge. He explained everything that had happened since his return, the strange things in the house, Sandra's nervous voice, the missing photograph, and the cryptic note. Mike listened intently, then clapped a reassuring hand on John's shoulder and said, "We'll figure this out, John, but be ready for the truth to be worse than you think." Those words sounded like a grim prophecy. Deep inside, John knew that something terrible lay ahead, something that would overshadow everything he had faced before. But he was ready for it. He was ready to find out the truth, no matter what it might be. The next morning, John and Mike decided to visit Sandra's workplace. But upon arriving at her office, they learned from the secretary that Sandra had quit 3 weeks ago. No one knew where she was or what she was doing now. With every step, the mystery deepened and darkened. Chapter 3. Unexpected Discoveries. John and Mike stood outside the office where Sandra had worked for the past few years. The world seemed to turn upside down. 3 weeks. Sandra had quit her job 3 weeks ago, and no one had bothered to tell John. This fact stunned him, making him realize that his life was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Mike was the first to break the silence. "John, this isn't just a family problem anymore. There's something much bigger going on here. We need to find her, and the sooner, the better." John nodded, his mind racing with questions. Who was this mysterious E? Why had Sandra quit her job, and where had she gone? He felt the answers were just out of reach, but he didn't know where to start. Deciding it was best to return home and think through their next move, John and Mike got into the car and drove back. On the way, John suddenly remembered their bank accounts. Their life had always been meticulously organized. Bills paid automatically, money always coming in on time. But if Sandra had really run off, something might be wrong with their finances. As soon as they got home, John called the bank to check the balance. When the bank operator finally checked his accounts, the voice on the other end of the line changed abruptly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Riley, but your accounts have been completely drained over the past 2 months. The balance is 0. Those words struck John like a bolt of lightning. The money he had saved for years was gone. Every cent he had earned and saved for their future had been taken. Sandra, she had done this. John felt anger and despair mix in his chest, but it wasn't over. The bank operator added, "We also noticed several large transfers to an account belonging to an Eric Swanson. Do you recognize that name?" Eric Swanson. John had never heard that name before, but his instincts told him this was the E who had signed the note. All the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture of betrayal. Mike, noticing how pale John had become, asked, "What happened?" John, struggling to keep his emotions in check, handed Mike the phone and quickly explained what he had learned. Inside, he felt that this was more than just infidelity. This was a carefully planned conspiracy, and Sandra might only be a part of it. Mike immediately made a decision. "We have to find this Swanson guy. If he's connected to Sandra, he might lead us to her. We can check him out in the database or hire a private investigator." John silently agreed. He was willing to do whatever it took to get to the truth. They decided to start by visiting a few places where Sandra might have shown up and by digging for information on Eric Swanson. The next morning, John and Mike went to a small bar on the outskirts of town where Sandra occasionally met with colleagues after work. The bartender remembered her immediately when John described her appearance. "Yeah, she's been here a few times over the last couple of months. Always with the same guy, tall, blonde, pretty cocky. Never liked him, but they were tight," the bartender said, pouring himself a coffee. That man. Danger. John slowly pulled out the army knife he always carried with him. As they stepped into the dimly lit building, they saw several abandoned crates and scattered papers. But most importantly, on the floor lay another note. It read, "If you want the truth, come alone, tonight at midnight, E." John knew he had to make a choice, stay in the shadows or face the danger head-on. Chapter 4. Injury and Return. Midnight, the old warehouse by the docks. John stood in the shadows, his heart pounding. The surrounding silence was broken only by the occasional splash of water and the distant echo of ship horns. In his hand, he tightly gripped his army knife, trying to focus. E had called for a one-on-one meeting, but Mike had insisted on staying nearby in case things went south. John couldn't refuse the help, but he also knew this could easily be a trap. The dim light of a street lamp at the corner of the building cast long shadows, and John finally steeled himself to enter. As he crossed the threshold into the warehouse, darkness enveloped him. The smell of dampness and old wood filled the air, heightening the sense of danger. John moved slowly, staying close to the walls. A voice echoed from deep within the warehouse, cold, confident, and slightly mocking. "Glad you made it, John. You're more persistent than I expected." John tensed, but tried not to show it. "Eric Swanson, I presume?" he asked, his voice steady, though inside a storm was brewing. "That's right," the voice confirmed. "You found me. Though I must admit, I thought I'd break you before now." A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man with slicked-back blonde hair and a smug grin. In his hand, he held a gun pointed directly at John. "Where's Sandra?" John demanded, trying to maintain control of the situation. Eric smirked. "Does it really matter? After what she did? She used you, John. But I'm sure you've already figured that out. She never intended to stay with you. You were just a stepping stone to a better life, for her and for me." John felt anger boiling inside him, but he kept himself from acting impulsively. There were too many unanswered questions, and he knew he had to be careful. "Why?" was all he managed to ask. Eric paced around John as if examining a trophy. "Because you were the perfect target, the model soldier, the faithful husband, believing in your family. You didn't even notice when we started closing in on you, first Sandra, then the money, and now—" Eric paused, aiming the gun directly at John's face. "Now I'm just going to take everything else." At that moment, the warehouse door burst open, and Mike stormed in with his gun drawn. "Don't move," he shouted, aiming at Eric. Eric, caught off guard, hesitated for a split second, but managed to fire his gun. The bullet struck John in the shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground, struggling to stay conscious. Mike immediately returned fire, forcing Eric to dive for cover behind some crates. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Gunshots echoed through the space, and debris flew as bullets hit walls and shattered glass. John, clutching his bleeding shoulder, crawled behind some crates for cover. His head was spinning, but he knew he couldn't leave Mike to face Eric alone. The firefight didn't last long. Mike, using the element of surprise, pushed Eric deeper into the warehouse where he found himself cornered. But instead of surrendering, Eric made a desperate dash toward an exit, triggering an old booby trap, a makeshift explosive device he had likely set up for a quick escape. The explosion was sudden, shaking the entire building. John felt the shock wave and then silence as the dust settled. When the dust cleared, Mike approached John, helping him to his feet. "Are you okay?" Mike asked, trying to gauge his friend's condition. John nodded, gritting his teeth against the pain. The wound in his shoulder was bad, but not fatal. But his mind was elsewhere. "We lost him, Mike, but Sandra's still out there. She has to be close." Mike nodded silently. Both men knew this wasn't over. John needed to get back home, heal, but now he was certain. This story was all morning. John struggled with the pain as he tended to his wound. That's when he heard a knock at the door. It took him a few seconds to gather himself before opening it. Standing on his doorstep was a woman he didn't expect. Tall, with chestnut hair tied back in a neat ponytail and a determined expression on her face. Her eyes were cautious but filled with purpose. She looked like someone on a serious mission. "Mr. Riley, my name is Amelia Hart." "We need to talk," she said, stepping past him into the house without waiting for an invitation. John barely managed to close the door as Amelia walked into the living room, her eyes scanning the space as if she was looking for something. John frowned, sensing that this visit was not a friendly one. "Who are you and what do you want?" he asked, watching her every move. Amelia turned to face him, her expression serious, but with a hint of something softer in her eyes. "I'm a private investigator. I've been working on a case involving financial fraud and illegal deals linked to your friend, Eric Swanson. Recently, I discovered that your wife, Sandra, is deeply involved in this mess. I should have found you sooner, but I didn't expect you to be so persistent." Her words hit John like a ton of bricks. He had expected many things, but not that someone was actually investigating this case and was so close to the truth. At first he was skeptical, but then he realized she might be his best chance to get to the bottom of all this, if she was really on his side. "What do you know?" he asked, gesturing for her to sit on the couch. Amelia sat down, choosing her words carefully. "Your wife chose the wrong partner. Swanson is a professional con artist who specializes in destroying people's lives to get their money. But here's the thing. Sandra isn't just a victim. She's been actively involved in his operations. When he vanished, she likely tried to distance herself, but it didn't work. She's in danger, John, and so are you." Her words were like a punch to the gut. John had hoped that Sandra was just a misguided woman who got caught up in something beyond her control. But her involvement in these schemes made him question everything he thought he knew about her. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that she needed help. "What's your plan?" he asked, looking at Amelia with new resolve. Amelia paused, as if assessing his willingness to go the distance. "We need to find Sandra before someone else does. I have leads, but I'll need your help. If you really want the truth and want to save her, we'll have to work together. But be warned, it's going to be dangerous." John didn't hesitate. Inside, a new purpose was burning. He had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be, and he had to save Sandra, even if there was no place for her in his future. "I'm in. What's our first move?" he asked, feeling his anger and pain being replaced by determination. Amelia nodded, approving of his resolve. "I have some contacts in the police force and in the criminal underworld. We'll start by tracking down those who might have seen her recently. But first, we need to secure you. Now that Swanson knows you're alive, he won't leave you alone." And so began their alliance. John and Amelia joined forces to find Sandra and take down Eric. Each step brought them closer to the truth, but also led them into deeper danger. Ahead lay new challenges, and John knew that the truth would come at a cost that might be even greater than he could imagine. Chapter 6. Deception and Betrayal. Several days had passed since John and Amelia joined forces. They spent their time analyzing clues, interviewing witnesses, and gathering information on Eric and Sandra's whereabouts. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that something far more sinister was at play. One day, they received a tip from one of Amelia's contacts in the police department. The contact claimed that Sandra had been spotted in a small town on the outskirts of the state, renting a house under an assumed name. Without hesitation, John and Amelia set out, hoping to finally track her down and get the answers they desperately needed. They arrived late at night, pulling up to a secluded house nestled deep in the woods. The place was far from any prying eyes, perfect for someone who didn't want to be found. John's heart raced as he saw a faint light flickering through one of the windows. Amelia signaled for caution as they approached the door, moving quietly. "Give me a minute, I'll check inside," Amelia whispered, pulling out a lock-picking kit. John nodded, taking a step back to cover her. Within minutes, the lock clicked and the door creaked open. Amelia paused, listening intently, but all was silent inside. "It seems clear," she said, stepping in first. John followed, ready for anything. The house was small and sparsely furnished, but it looked like someone had left in a hurry. Papers and photographs were scattered across a table alongside a half-empty glass of wine. John stepped closer and saw a photograph that immediately caught his eye. It was one of him and Sandra, the very one that had gone missing from their home. "It's her," John whispered, running his fingers over the frame. But before he could process it further, Amelia called out to him from across the room. "John, take a look at this," she said, holding out a document. It was a bank statement, but not from their joint account. This was from a secret account Sandra had opened months before he left for Vietnam. The statement showed large sums of money being funneled from various offshore accounts. "This is her money. This is what she and Eric stole," John said, bitterness lacing his voice. Amelia was about to respond when her attention suddenly shifted to the window. She quickly pulled John to the side, and in that instant, the glass shattered as a bullet tore through the air. Someone had opened fire on the house. They dropped to the floor, seeking cover behind the couch. John reached for the gun Mike had given him days earlier and cautiously peeked out. Outside, he saw dark figures moving closer to the house. "It's a trap," John yelled, shielding Amelia as she drew her weapon. Bullets whizzed past them, but John and Amelia held their ground. They returned fire, aiming at the silhouettes in the darkness. Suddenly, John heard one of the attackers shout, "Don't kill them! We need them both alive!" Those words sent a chill down John's spine. They weren't just after him. They knew he'd be here with Amelia. It was as if someone had been tracking their every move. The situation was spiraling out of control. Amelia quickly formulated a plan. "We can't stay here. We need to break out through the back door. I'll cover you." They began to retreat toward the exit, firing as they moved. But then one of the attackers got too close, and John saw his face. It was Mike. Shock froze John for a split second. Mike, the friend who had helped him from the start, was now holding him at gunpoint. "Mike? What the hell are you doing?" John shouted, unable to believe what he was seeing. Mike smirked, his gun trained on John. "Sorry, old friend, but you knew too much. I should have stopped you back at the warehouse. Sandra wasn't the only one working for Swanson. I've been with them all along." Mike's words hit John like a hammer. Everything he believed in crumbled in an instant, but he couldn't afford to freeze. Adrenaline took over and he fired at Mike, forcing him to dive for cover. "Amelia, let's go!" John shouted, and they both sprinted toward the back door, bullets flying around them. They burst out into the dense forest, running as fast as they could while their pursuers gave chase. The trees provided cover, but there was no time to rest. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached a safe distance. John, gasping for breath, turned to Amelia. "Mike, he was the traitor all along," John said, the realization still sinking in. Amelia nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We can't trust anyone, John. They're coming for us from all sides now, but we still have to find Sandra. She's our only key to ending this." John felt shattered, but inside him, a new fire was burning. Mike's betrayal had made him stronger. Now he was prepared to do whatever it took to uncover the truth and stop those who had destroyed his life, but he also knew that the price might be higher than he had ever imagined. Chapter 7. Disturbing Suspicions. The forest cloaked John and Amelia, hiding them from their pursuers, but the tension lingered in the air. They walked along a narrow path leading to an old highway, hoping it would take them to safety. Every rustle, every movement in the bushes kept them on edge. No words were exchanged, just a shared focus on survival. When they finally emerged onto the road, Amelia spotted an abandoned cabin near the edge of the woods, a perfect place to catch their breath and plan their next move. Inside, the cabin was cold and damp, but they sat near an old, unused fireplace trying to warm themselves in the eerie silence. John, his head throbbing from exhaustion and stress, leaned back against the wall. His thoughts were a tangled mess of questions with no clear answers. He still couldn't wrap his mind around Mike's betrayal. This was the man who had been like a brother to him, and now everything felt like a lie. Amelia broke the silence. "We need to keep moving, John. I know this is hard, but we don't have time to dwell on what's happened." Her voice was firm, but there was an undertone of unease. John looked at her closely. Over the past few days, she had become a crucial ally, but there was something in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was just the tension, but now, John started to feel a gnawing suspicion. "Did you know that Mike was a traitor all along?" John asked, staring at her intently. Amelia frowned, slightly, as if caught off guard by the question. "No, of course not," she replied, glancing away for a moment. "If I had known, we wouldn't be in this mess." John felt a flicker of irritation. Was she telling the truth or just playing her part well? After Mike's betrayal, he could no longer fully trust anyone. He recalled all the strange moments in the past few days. How Amelia always seemed to know where to go. How she found information that should have been out of reach even for an experienced detective. "Why are you helping me?" he suddenly asked, trying to uncover her true motives. "You could have walked away when things got too dangerous." Amelia hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because I can't let people like Swanson and Mike keep ruining lives. And because I want the truth too. I have my own reasons, John. This case is more than just a job for me." Her response was convincing, but something about it felt incomplete. John sensed she was holding something back, but he decided not to press her for now. After all, she had saved his life more than once, and without her, he'd be in even greater danger. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the buzz of a phone. Amelia pulled out the device from her pocket, her face tensing as she saw the caller ID. "It's one of my sources," she said briefly, stepping outside to take the call. John watched her through the window. She spoke quietly, but her body language was tense. After a few minutes, Amelia returned inside, her expression serious. "There's news," she said, slipping the phone back into her pocket. "Sandra was spotted at a motel in the southern part of the state. She's there alone. No security. If we hurry, we can catch her." But John felt a knot of doubt tightening in his stomach. Everything was starting to feel too convenient. The information always arriving at the right moment, the enemies showing up exactly where they were expected. But he had no other choice. If this was a trap, he was willing to take the risk to get to the truth about Sandra. "All right," he said curtly. "Let's head out." They left the cabin and climbed into an old pickup truck they had found by the road. Time was running out, and John knew this would be a decisive encounter. But deep down, he couldn't shake the suspicion that Amelia was hiding something from him. As they drove down the deserted highway, John's thoughts kept circling around one question. Could he really trust the person sitting beside him? And who would still be standing when all the truths were finally revealed? Chapter 8. The Moment of Truth. The motel where John and Amelia were headed was located on the outskirts of a small, desolate town surrounded by empty fields and forgotten roads. The place felt like a ghost town, with run-down buildings and flickering neon signs casting eerie shadows in the night. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear. They arrived under the cover of darkness, the only sounds being the wind rustling through the dry grass and the occasional distant hum of a passing car. John surveyed the area. No signs of an ambush, no suspicious activity, but that uneasy feeling still gnawed at him. "We need to be careful," John said, turning off the truck's headlights and pulling the keys from the ignition. Amelia nodded, checking her weapon. They exited the truck and approached the motel room following the tip Amelia had received. John stayed slightly behind, analyzing every step. His suspicions about Amelia hadn't faded, and he remained on high alert. When they reached the door, Amelia signaled for him to stop. She pressed her ear to the door, trying to pick up any sounds from inside. Then she slowly turned the handle. The door was unlocked. They exchanged a glance, and Amelia pushed the door open, entering first. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp on the nightstand, casting long shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the scent of stale cigarettes and something faintly chemical. In the center of the room stood Sandra, her face tear-streaked but defiant. She was wearing simple clothes, which only highlighted her exhaustion and desperation. "John." Her voice wavered as she saw him. John froze in place. His heart pounded as he looked at the woman who had once been the center of his life, but he knew he couldn't let emotions cloud his judgment. "Sandra," he said coldly, "tell me everything, right now." Sandra sobbed and tried to step toward him, but he held up a hand, keeping her at a distance. "John, I know it's hard to believe, but I was trapped. Eric forced me into this. I couldn't get out. He threatened me. He threatened us." She spoke quickly, as if trying to get it all out before time ran out. Amelia stood nearby, her gaze fixed on Sandra. But John noticed that her eyes kept darting toward the door, as if she was expecting something or someone. "Why did you run? Why didn't you tell me the truth from the start?" John tried to keep his voice steady, but the tension in his chest was mounting. Sandra tried to explain. "I was scared. I thought I could handle it on my own, but everything spiraled out of control. Eric, he controlled everything, even Mike. He was in on it too. I wanted to protect you, but..." Before she could finish, Amelia suddenly raised a hand to silence her. "That's enough. Where's Eric? Where is he hiding?" Amelia's voice was sharp, devoid of the sympathy she had shown before. Sandra hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the window. "I don't know," she finally said. "He left as soon as he realized I wasn't going to follow his orders anymore." John's unease deepened. Suddenly, the door burst open, and armed men in black tactical gear flooded the room. Within seconds, both John and Amelia were overpowered and handcuffed. Sandra stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. "What's happening?" John shouted, struggling against the restraints. A man walked into the room, someone John never expected to see again. Eric Swanson, alive and unharmed, strode in with a smug grin on his face. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew he had already won. John," Eric said, shaking his head. "You knew this could be a trap, and still, you walked right into it. How naive." Amelia, who stood beside John, was silent, her face expressionless. John looked at her, and the truth hit him like a sledgehammer. She had betrayed him. She had been working with Eric all along. "You," John whispered, his voice thick with anger and betrayal. Amelia turned to him, her eyes cold and unrepentant. "I'm sorry, John, but this is just business." Eric's grin widened as he addressed Sandra. "And you, dear, you've held up your end of the deal. You're free to go. But remember, freedom is a fragile thing." Sandra nodded, her eyes filled with regret and fear. She knew that she had made a deal with the devil, and now she would have to live with the consequences. Eric gestured to one of his men, who struck John on the head, sending him into darkness. As he slipped into unconsciousness, the last thing John heard was Eric's cold voice. "Now we can finish what we started." The darkness closed in, and John realized that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new, darker chapter in his life, one where he would have to find his way out of a labyrinth of lies and treachery. Chapter 9. The Final Battle. The darkness surrounding John was thick and suffocating. He gradually regained consciousness, the pain in his head throbbing like a relentless drumbeat. His senses slowly returned, bringing with them the realization that he was lying on a cold, hard floor. He tried to move, but his hands and feet were tightly bound. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw that he was in an old, abandoned warehouse. Faint rays of morning light streamed through a small, dirty window, casting eerie shadows across the rusted metal beams and scattered crates. The door creaked open, and Eric Swanson walked in, exuding an air of confidence and control. Behind him was Amelia, her face a mask of cold indifference. John struggled against his restraints, but it was no use. "Good morning, John," Eric said with a smirk. "I hope you're feeling well enough for our little chat." John glared at him, anger boiling just beneath the surface. "What do you want, Eric? Why keep me alive?" Eric chuckled, amused by the question. "Oh, John, you still don't get it, do you? You've been useful to me in ways you can't even imagine, but now that we've reached the end game, I figured I'd give you one last chance to say goodbye." Amelia stood silently beside Eric, her gaze fixed on John. There was no trace of the woman who had saved his life, only the calculating agent who had played him from the start. John's suspicions had been correct all along, but realizing it now felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Before John could respond, the door opened again, and Sandra was led into the room by one of Eric's men. She looked pale and shaken, her eyes red from crying, but there was still a glimmer of resolve in her expression. She was brought to stand in front of John, her hands trembling as she looked at him. "John," Sandra's voice cracked as she tried to speak. "I'm sorry, I never wanted it to end like this." John stared at her, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions tearing through him. "Sandra, why? Why did you do this?" Tears welled up in Sandra's eyes. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could protect you and still find a way out. But I was wrong, John. I was so wrong." Eric, clearly enjoying the drama, stepped forward. "Touching, isn't it? But enough with the sentimentality. I have a business to run." He nodded to one of his men, who handed him a gun. Eric waved it in front of John, savoring the moment. "You know, John, I've been thinking about how to end this. And I realized, why not let you go out with a bang? After all, you've been such a persistent thorn in my side." John tensed, his mind racing for a way out. But just as Eric raised the gun, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. The door burst open, and in stormed Mike, battered and bloodied but alive, his gun drawn and aimed at Eric. "Drop it, Eric," Mike shouted, his voice filled with determination. "It's over." Eric's smug expression faltered for the first time. He hadn't expected Mike to survive, let alone show up here. But instead of surrendering, Eric smirked and made a sudden move, throwing Sandra between himself and Mike as a human shield. "Don't be stupid, Mike," Eric sneered. "You know I'm not going down that easily." The tension in the room was unbearable. Mike kept his gun trained on Eric, his eyes flicking between Sandra and John. John, still tied up, tried to catch Mike's attention, silently pleading for him to act. In that split second, Sandra made a desperate decision. She threw herself to the side, breaking free from Eric's grip, giving Mike a clear shot. Mike didn't hesitate. He fired, the bullet hitting Eric square in the chest. Eric staggered backward, his face twisted in shock and pain, before collapsing to the ground. For a moment, the warehouse was silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing. Mike rushed over to John and quickly cut through his restraints. As John stood, the pain in his body was dwarfed by the overwhelming relief of finally seeing Eric defeated. "It's over," Mike said, his voice hoarse. John looked at him, struggling to reconcile the man who had betrayed him with the one who had just saved his life. "Why, Mike? Why did you turn on me?" Mike lowered his gaze, guilt evident in his eyes. "They had my family, John. They threatened to kill them if I didn't play along. But I couldn't let them take you too. I had to make it right." Before John could reply, Amelia stepped forward, her face unreadable. "We need to get out of here. Eric's men will be coming, and we don't have much time." John nodded, though the anger and mistrust still simmered inside him. Together, they helped Sandra to her feet, and the group moved quickly out of the warehouse. As they exited, John glanced back at Eric's lifeless body, a sense of finality washing over him. The drive back was tense and silent. John's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts about the betrayals, the lies, and the price he had paid for the truth. But despite everything, he knew this chapter of his life was finally closing. They dropped Sandra off at a safe location where she could start over, far from the chaos that had consumed their lives. She thanked John with a tearful farewell, but they both knew that this was the end for them. There was no going back. Mike, still haunted by his actions, left with a promise to make amends somehow, though neither of them was sure how that would be possible. As for Amelia, she disappeared as quickly as she had entered John's life, leaving only questions and a lingering sense of distrust. When John finally returned home, he was exhausted, battered but alive. He had lost a lot: friends, trust, and a life he once knew. But he had gained something as well, a clarity that could only come from facing the darkest parts of himself and those around him. As he sat alone in his house, the weight of everything he had been through settled on his shoulders. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could see a future, one where he was free from the shadows of his past. And so, with the dawn breaking outside, John knew that the battle was over, but the journey to rebuild his life was just beginning. Chapter 10. The price of truth. Months had passed since the final confrontation at the warehouse. John's life had slowly started to regain some semblance of normalcy, but the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. The small town where he had made a new home was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind. Here, he could finally breathe again, away from the betrayals and the violence that had nearly consumed him. Sandra had vanished from his life, leaving behind only memories that felt more like nightmares. She had promised to stay away, to start over somewhere far from the mess she had helped create. John hadn't tried to find her. He knew their story was over. Whatever they once had was gone, buried under the weight of lies and deceit. Amelia had also disappeared as quietly and efficiently as she had entered his life. John had expected it. She was a professional after all, and whatever connection they had formed was a means to an end. Still, he couldn't shake the lingering questions about her true motives and whether she had ever been on his side at all. Mike, the man who had once been like a brother to John, had left after their final encounter. He had tried to make amends, but John knew that their friendship would never be the same. The betrayal had cut too deep, and some wounds simply didn't heal. Mike had his own demons to face, and John doubted they would cross paths again. John spent his days working as a mechanic at a small garage in town. It was honest, straightforward work, something he found solace in. Fixing cars gave him a sense of control, a way to mend what was broken, even if his own life couldn't be repaired as easily. The people in the town were kind, but they kept their distance, sensing that John was a man with a troubled past. He didn't mind. He wasn't looking for connections. He had learned the hard way that trust was a fragile thing, and he was in no hurry to rebuild it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets, John found himself walking along the shore. The rhythmic crashing of the waves against the rocks was soothing, a reminder that life, like the tide, ebbed and flowed. As he stood there watching the sunset, he reflected on everything that had happened. The price of truth had been steep. He had lost nearly everything he once held dear, and the path to where he stood now had been paved with betrayal, pain, and loss. But standing there with the salty breeze on his face and the vast ocean before him, John realized that he had also gained something invaluable: freedom. He was no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past. He had faced them, fought them, and emerged on the other side, scarred but alive. The truth, as brutal as it had been, had set him free. He no longer carried the weight of lies or the burden of false hopes. His life was his own again, unshackled from the manipulations of others. For the first time in what felt like years, John felt a sense of peace. It was fragile, delicate even, but it was real. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Rebuilding a life from the ashes of the old one never was. But he was ready to face it, step by step, with the quiet strength that had carried him through the darkest of times. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, John turned and began to walk back toward town. The shadows lengthened, but he no longer feared them. He had seen what lurked in the dark, and he had survived. Now, he could focus on the light ahead, on the possibility of a future that, while uncertain, was truly his own. The battles of the past were over, and the journey toward a new beginning had just begun. He also knew it could be more than just a simple meeting. When they arrived at the warehouse, the atmosphere was thick with